Hey there, it's Madness, and welcome to another episode of Fuck You, Hillary Clinton, I Hate You. This time we're going to talk about revolutions. Why haven't the people revolted? This country has a rich history of uprisings and revolts. Sometimes they're peacefully organized and effective. Other times they have some sort of violent action attached to them. I've been thinking of a concept of revolution in this country, and if what Bernie Sanders called for, a political revolution, does that actually qualify? The definition of revolution, other than the one about celestial bodies circling in orbit, is one that has 5 definitions. 1. Sudden, radical, or complete change. 2. A fundamental change in political organization, especially the overthrow or renunciation of one government or ruler and the substitution of another by the governed. 3. Activity or movement designed to effect fundamental changes in the socio-economic situation. 4. A fundamental change in the way of thinking about or visualizing something, a change of paradigm. 5. A changeover in use or preference, especially in technology, such as the computer revolution. I'm sorry, but none of those definitions pertain to the organization of revolution. Think about it. There is nothing sudden, radical, or complete about the change that is being touted in their platform or objectives. No overthrow of a government, no activity that's designed to effect changes in the socio-economic situation. The last 2 definitions don't apply to political situations, but technology and perception. Looking back at history, there were periods of unrest caused by events in our nations that were shaped by changing times. The first major one of the late 19th century was caused by labor, strikes that were met with armed resistance and conflict. In 1877, the Reading Railroad strike led to a massacre by the National Guard of Pennsylvania. Strikers threw bricks and stones and were shot down. 10 people died. In 1885, in Rock Springs Massacre happened in Wyoming, and that was caused by white immigrant miners who were getting paid more than Chinese immigrants. So the railroad decided they would hire more Chinese to replace the white workers. This angered the white immigrants, and they attacked Chinese. 28 Chinese miners died and 15 were injured. The rioters burned 75 Chinese homes. The cost of damage back then was over $150,000 or $4 million in today's money. This caused a wave of anti-Chinese violence around the country. The riot started because of racial prejudice and because of resentment against the Union Pacific Railroad for using cheap labor. Federal troops were sent in to protect the miners and railroad property. The next big strike was in a Pittsburgh area town called Homestead, Pennsylvania, in 1892. This would lead to the biggest massacre in U.S. history until the 20th century. The dispute was between Carnegie Steel and the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. Carnegie Steel was led by a man called Henry Frick, a real fucking prick who was determined to break the unions. As the plants were growing, Carnegie Steel started hiring more workers who were less experienced and non-union, which of course angered the union workers. There had been 2 previous strikes at that plant, which were won by the workers in 1882 and in 1889. In 1889, the Pinkertons Detective Agency were brought in to protect strike breakers. The Union seized the town and with 5,000 people drove 125 deputized agents away. This emboldened the union workers, and when the collective bargaining agreement came up for negotiations in 1892, management was ready. So were the union workers. there was a battle between union workers and the Pinkertons, and the Pinkertons were driven away. The governor sent in the militia with 4,000 soldiers surrounding the plant, and another 2,000 overlooking the city. The company reopened the plant with strikebreakers. Many of them were black workers, and a race war between white and black non-union workers had broken out inside the plant. Someone tried to assassinate Frick in his New York office. That person had nothing to do with the strike, but it hurt the perception of a union with the public. After all that, the workers voted to go back to work, and the union collapsed because they went back to work for less than they originally were getting. It took 40 plus years for the union to regain their power at U.S. Steel, and in 1942, the United Steelworkers Union was formed. The next biggest labor uprising was called the Ludlow Massacre, when the Colorado National Guard and the company guards attacked a tent colony of 1,200 striking coal miners and their families in 1914. In retaliation for this, the miners armed themselves and began a rampage over a 40-mile area that cost 200 lives. The owner of the mine was John T. Rockefeller. The incident led to promoting of child labor laws and an 8-hour workday. The largest labor uprising was the Battle of Blair Mountain in 1921 in Logan County, West Virginia. The miners tried to unionize, and 10,000 coal miners confronted 3,000 lawmen. The real Mary Harris Jones, Mother Jones, held a rally calling on the miners not to march, but they did, and the bloodbath began. The details are amazing. Something like out of a movie. President Harding not only sent in the army, but sent in bombers, and they started dropping gas and explosive bombs on the strikers and the towns. Over 985 miners were indicted for murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and treason. Union membership went from 50,000 to 10,000. Not till 1935 did the United Mine Workers fully organize in West Virginia, as did many workers during the FDR's presidency and his New Deal. The next wave of uprisings were over civil rights, which began in the 1960s. The Harlem Race Riot in 1964, this was said to have caused other riots in other cities like Philadelphia, Chicago, all over New Jersey. This riot started when a police officer killed a 9th grader who he said had pulled a knife on him. Eyewitnesses in the school where the incident happened claimed there was no knife, and within a few days, protesters of police brutality led a revolt and violence broke out in the community, where 500 people were injured and 465 people were arrested, and the police officer was cleared of all charges of the killing of a 15-year-old boy. In 1965, riots in Watts broke out of a traffic incident where a black motorist got beaten, and it led to 6 days of rioting and looting in LA. 34 people died. This was the worst riot until the Rodney King incident in 1992, where 55 people were killed and 2,000 people were injured and over $1 billion of damage was caused. Race riots happened throughout the 60s in Detroit, Omaha, Memphis, Newark, Milwaukee. And after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968, riots occurred in Detroit, New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Kansas City, Trenton, New Jersey. and they were huge. 1968 was also when the riots at the Democratic National Convention happened in Chicago. And in 1970, on the campus of Kent State University, 4 students were killed by the National Guard. I can go on and give you numerous uprisings like Wounded Knee, the Attica Prison Uprising, the New Mexico State Penitentiary, and many more. More recently, Ferguson and Baltimore had major riots over the deaths of black youth at the hands of the police. Not till the crash of 2008 and the subsequent bailout of banks that caused the uprising of the Occupy Wall Street movement did we have another major revolt in this nation. This time, it was started by social media, and it was over income inequality. The demonstration on the Brooklyn Bridge, Zuccotti Park, and in Oakland, as well as a NATO summit in Chicago, the G20 summit in Pittsburgh and Seattle, and the protest at this year's DNC in Philly are just some of the uprising and revolts that occurred out of this incident. The problem is that many of these uprisings have been put down by either military or paramilitary forces employed by the government and by the corporations that were the cause of the unrest in the first place. So what is Bernie's Our Revolution? Is it a real uprising or just an organization whose intent is to be invited at the table where the adults eat? I think it's neither. It's a money grab by Jeff Weaver to show the Democratic Party that they can raise money. So far, it's not working. And Hillary has raised $153 million in 1 month. That's almost as much as Bernie did the whole entire campaign. So what leverage do they have? None. So what can we do? Well, I'll tell you in my next broadcast of Fuck You, Hillary Clinton, I hate you. Stay tuned.